Okay, so welcome everybody to 4 weeks to better photography. This is the first time I'm doing a virtual class, and you are the inaugural group. So you should be honored that you are part of this first group, and I value the feedback that I'm hoping you're going to give me so that I can do this class for future folks and improve it as we go along. So if you joined me for the Getting More Wow in Your Photos webinar, you know who I am. My name is Darlene. My website is fourviewphotography.com. Hopefully you're familiar with some of my articles on there or on Digital Photography School. I've been a photographer for over 25 years and teaching for 2. So my passion right now lies in teaching others how to improve their photography, and obviously getting more wow in your photos makes me excited as well. So when you get wow photos, I get excited. Okay, so that's a little bit about me. Let's familiarize ourselves with the system today. We're going to be doing a little bit different because this is an interactive class. So the first thing we want to do is just check that we can do what's called a hands up. There should be a little hand on your control panel for the GoToWebinar meeting control panel. If everybody can just put their hands up, make sure, because at some point, if you have a question, I'm going to ask you to put your hand up, and then you'll be answering, we'll be discussing those things verbally. Okay, so I see almost everybody's hands up. Donna, I'm not seeing yours. Perfect. Jillian, I'm not seeing yours, but you're probably on the panel, so you're not having that. Perfect. Awesome. So everybody's found it. I'm going to put your hands down. So during the course of the class, if you have a question, as we go along, put your hand up. So this is not going to be lecture, and then Q&A at the end. It's going to be discussion, just like I would in my regular classroom classes. So if a question comes up during the material, please stick your hand up. Otherwise, if I don't see any hands up, I'm going to keep on trucking through. Okay, so that's our first little test. So without further ado, this is what we're going to cover in the next 4 weeks. Okay, so a little bit of an outline. We're going to review some camera basics first. Based on everybody's filled in of the questionnaire that I sent you, there are some camera basics questions, so I'm going to make sure that we cover that. Using motion for more dynamic images. Okay, we're going to cover a lot of motion. We'll do that today as well. How to compose better images and having more impact. So that goes along with the getting more wow in your photos that we talked about in the pre-webinar. Now we're going to talk about lenses, some of that today and ongoing. Okay, what lens to choose in what situation and what to buy. I get that question a lot in my classes. What should I buy? Okay. We're going to talk about photography of people and how to get better photos of people, friends, and when you're traveling. We're going to talk about good light. What is it and how to find it? How do you go about looking for good light, and how do you know when you've actually found it? Okay. And a little bit about storytelling. So how to create some storytelling with one image and a series of images. So that's a little bit about what we're going to do in the next 4 weeks. Okay. So we're going to start with some camera basics. Now I see that Olivia is back in again. Let's just do a little test here and see if we can hear her. Try saying something, Olivia. Let's see if we can hear you.
Hey.
Hello, welcome.
It's working.
So just tell us where you're joining from and a random fact about yourself.
I'm in Brisbane, Australia at the moment. Random fact, I'm from Melbourne and lived in Dublin for a while, and now I'm here.
Awesome. Welcome. Truly international guest. Perfect. Okay, and we've had Paula just join us. And still no mic. Okay, so carrying on with some camera basics. So let's start with some things that are considered part of the exposure triangle. If you haven't heard about that before, I'm going to talk a little bit about the three pieces of the settings in your camera that control the exposure and the amount of exposure that your camera gets. The first one being the ISO. So in this class, this is an interactive class. So what I want you to do is, if you know what ISO is, please stick your hand up, because I'm not going to tell you guys everything. I want those that know to shout it out if you know. Okay, I saw Sharana's hand up and it went back down. So Olivia, tell us what the ISO is.
How sensitive the camera is to the light, is that?
Absolutely correct. Beautiful.
Awesome.
Beautiful. There it is. Look at that. Look at you go. Okay, so it's the camera sensor and how sensitive it is to light. And the ISO and the sensitivity is dependent on the camera body that you have. Okay, so this is one area where the newer technology has made huge advances. So if you have a camera that's 2 or 3 years old, you may have one that struggles a little bit in higher ISOs. Okay, and we'll get into that. Does anybody know what it controls? So how does it change the look of your picture? Anybody know? No hands on that one. What happens if we do 100 ISO versus, say, 6000? Does it change the look of your picture at all? Okay, we've got Sharana. Okay, go ahead, Sharana.
The higher the ISO, my understanding is the more light is let into the camera.
That is correct, yes. There's a little bit more piece to that. It actually changes the look of your picture by controlling the amount of noise. Okay, does everybody know what noise is? Just put your hand up if you don't. I'm going to show you an example of noise. Okay, so by increasing the ISO, you gain noise. Noise is that speckly looking stuff that looks like little pebbles in your picture or little light specks that shouldn't be there. Often they're a funny or an off color, or they may be little white specks. That's noise, okay? So as you increase the ISO, you gain more noise, and you also lose some quality in your image in the areas of color, contrast, sharpness, and saturation. So it's just not quite as punchy, and it looks a little bit degraded as you go up to the higher ISOs. So I'm going to show you an example of that. So here's a scene that, just a quick scene I shot in Glacier National Park. We drove through their road. This is 200 ISO, so relatively low. Okay, let's compare it to 12,000 ISO. So when we look at the full picture, you don't see a big difference. Okay, let's look closer up. So this is 200 ISO. It looks pretty clear. Where you start to see the difference, now let me know if you can't see it. Okay, it looks all speckly. Does everybody see that? And you gain you lose quality, and what you lose in the shadow areas is, look at the difference in the mountain and the shadow. I'll do it back again. You sort of lose the amount of detail, so it just doesn't look as crisp, and there's not as many fine details in the rocks. Okay? But this is my camera. This is the 5D Mark III, which is about a year old. Any of the cameras that are within sort of that age range, up in this high ISO, I have not applied any noise reduction software or anything to manipulate it. This is out of the camera, okay? So any of the newer cameras have a really good capability of shooting this type of high ISO. Okay? If you have an older camera, you may see a lot more grain than this, because this is pretty darn good for 12,000 ISO. It's kind of crazy, actually. Okay, now I saw that Mike just came in. Let's give Mike a try and see if he can unmute. And I might put you on the spot. Can you speak, Mike?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can. Tell us where you're joining from and a random fact about yourself.
Okay, I'm calling from North Grafton, Mass, which is about 30 miles west of Boston, Massachusetts. Random fact, I know you mentioned charity earlier. I'm in the process of running a charity campaign called 10K on 10-1 for Charity Water.
I saw that. That's awesome. I liked it on Facebook for you. Awesome. Awesome. Thanks for joining. And we have Liliana. I'm going to unmute you and see if we can hear you.
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Tell us where you're joining from. I know where you are, but the rest of them don't. And
Okay, I'm from Lima, Peru.
awesome.
And I'm glad to join you all here.
I'm glad you made
Okay.
it.
I didn't have time to, yes, I'm sorry. I didn't have time to download my 3 photos, so.
Not to worry.
Do you want me to still? Yeah?
Not to
Okay.
worry. No, stay with us. And this was just for something random. You can always post them to the group, and I can comment it for you later. So not a problem. And you'll get a recording. You'll get a recording either tomorrow or the next day of this class, so you can pick up the stuff that you missed in the first few minutes.
All right. Okay.
Perfect. So awesome. Everybody's on, I think. We're still just missing Rod, who was having technical problems. Okay, so we're up to shutter speed now. Who knows what the shutter speed is? How would we define the shutter speed in the camera? I want to go through some of this stuff fairly quickly. Okay, I saw Brenda's hand. Brenda?
So that's how fast or how slow your shutter actually opens and closes.
Opens and closes. Perfect. That's exactly it. And so it's the length of time that it's opened. And the shutter is inside the camera body, so it's also dependent on the camera body. And every camera will have different maximums and minimums. Right? Generally, if you have an SLR, the maximum is going to be 30 seconds or bulb, and the minimum will be either a 4,000 or an 8,000. So that will be the fastest. Okay? What does it control? So if ISO controls how much noise is in your picture, what does the shutter speed control in terms of the changing the look of your picture, right? Anybody? So if we have a slow shutter speed versus a fast one, okay, Sharana, go ahead.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
We can.
Hi. Oh, thanks. The amount of light you allow into the camera, the longer the shutter speed is open, the more light is allowed into the camera. The faster the shutter speed, the less the light into the
Okay,
camera.
that is true of all the factors of the exposure triangle, but how does it change the look of your picture? Because if we do, say, a half a second versus a 500th of a second, they could potentially look very different. How? Do you know?
With a slower shutter speed, it's going to look more blurry.
Exactly.
With a faster shutter speed, it's going to be more sharp. That's what I
Yeah,
say.
you're on the right track. Yeah, you're on the right track. So what she's talking about is it controls motion. Okay, so either blurring or freezing is what she's talking about, what she mentioned. Okay, so depending on what shutter speed you choose, you're either going to add or incorporate motion into your picture or freeze a moving object potentially, and that will be dependent on the shutter speed. Okay, so here's a little example. This is just, some boring pictures of an intersection down the street from where we live. The cars are moving the same speed in both photos. So in the one on the left, taken at a 30th of a second, you see that the van is blurry. The one on the right, taken at a 500th of a second, going the same speed, they are frozen. So they look like they're sitting there, but they're not. Okay? So something about shutter speed, you have to be careful hand holding. So if you're not using a tripod, what is the minimum shutter speed that you can use? Anybody? There's a rule of thumb. What have you heard in terms of how slow can you shoot without having to put the camera on the tripod? Okay, Brenda? Brenda?
The same as the length of your, or millimeters of your lens.
Beautiful, beautiful. You guys are smart. Okay, so for those of you that aren't familiar with that rule of thumb, it's 1 divided by the focal length of your lens. So if you're using a 200 millimeter lens, you want to shoot it at least 1/200th of a second or faster. Okay, if you're under that, so slower would be 100th of a second in this example, you could get what's called camera shake. So the motion is now incorporated coming from the actual camera movement in your hands. Okay, perfect. So here's another comparison. Another good example of when you would want to blur something would be moving water. So the one on the left is 100th of a second versus 2.5 seconds. You have a very different look of the flowing water. So you get that sort of misty, foggy appearance when the water is flowing through and a longer exposure. You do need a tripod when you're talking about shutter speeds that long. Right? Another example would be freezing or blurring. So here's a helicopter. You can see that the one on the left is blurring it, and it looks like it's actually moving. The one on the right, to me, is actually a little bit creepy, like it looks like it's going to fall out of the sky. Luckily, it's only a few feet off the ground. Okay, so when you're doing things that are moving, you have total control and choice over, do I freeze them or do I blur them, and which is best in each case might depend on the subject and what your intention is for that subject. Okay, so when are some instances that you might want to blur? Any ideas? Throw them out there. What kinds of subjects? I've already given you a couple of ideas. Anybody else have any other ideas? Brenda again. Okay, Brenda.
Sorry. Somebody like riding a bike to show that they're actually moving, not just kind of standing there on their bike or propping it up or whatever.
Sure, so a moving object, perfect, okay. Any other ideas? We've got Paula. Paula?
I do a lot of photography of dancers, and especially belly dancers. So like the skirt, getting them the swirl can be really pretty.
Okay. Yeah, so that's all moving subjects, perfect. Okay, so the motion of something moving. So it could be a person, a vehicle, subway car, that kind of thing, right? Some other examples might be like the flowing water that I mentioned. Okay, how about star trails at night? So star trails are just that. It's actually capturing the stars moving across the sky in a really, really long exposure. Okay, sometimes they'll do them in multiple exposures and blend them together, but that's the general technique. Okay, and also to blur the background. Okay, so Brenda mentioned a bicyclist going by, and one of the things we're going to give you as an assignment today in practice is to do some panning. So that's where you're actually going to freeze the subject that's moving and blur the background. Okay. Did you have a question, Paula, or your hand was up? No, her hand's down. Okay. Okay, so this is what panning looks like. So the basic premise of panning is that you use a slower shutter speed, but you move the camera in the direction that the object is passing you. So if it's moving in from left to right like this truck, you actually follow it. So for those of you that are into sports like golf or hockey or baseball or anything where you're swinging something, they will tell you, of course, the most important thing is your follow through. The same thing applies to panning. So you follow the object, don't take the picture and then stop, you keep going with it. Okay, so that's kind of one of the keys of panning. There are some settings for you. I will put this in the homework with this sheet so you have these in your PDF of your homework. So start the idea with panning. Some settings to start with on your camera would be high speed or burst mode, so that when you hold down the shutter button, it takes, you know, a few pictures. It goes click, 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 click. Right? I generally set it to shutter priority. I will start with about a 30th of a second and then just play with it from there, depending on if I've got too much blur, not enough blur, or how fast the object is moving. And it takes a little bit of practice to kind of find the right speed to move with the moving object. Okay? So it's kind of an exercise in you have to take a few shots to get a good one. Okay? But it's kind of a neat technique, especially when you have a subject that maybe isn't as interesting, or like I said, the background is kind of boring. So I'm just going to show you a few examples of panning. The shutter speed that I shot them with is up in the corner there. This is just in a mall. This was an interesting carnival ride. They had shopping carts, and the kids could ride in the shopping carts going in a circle. Okay, going a little faster. I matched the speed. The car is pretty sharp. Notice that the wheels are still moving because they're moving faster than the car, but the background is completely blurred. You can't see it at all, which is great because it's abstracting it, and you get that beautiful separation between the subject and the background. Okay. Even managed to get the San Francisco police. Don't tell them. Okay, now this one is even more blurry. Some people will say, okay, this is too blurry, and they'll reject it. I actually kind of like it. So photography is one of those very subjective things. This was done on a photo walk in San Francisco, actually with Trey Ratcliffe, who's stuck in customs, HDR, if you follow his blog. And he had a very different shot of this dog. We were all in the park, and the dog was chasing the ball, and he had shot him with fast shutter speed to freeze him, and I had tried some panning and done a very low shutter speed, so low in fact that the dog's legs are almost disappearing, right? I kind of like it, and it definitely implies motion. So again, it's totally subjective. Okay, so there's some other ways that we can create motion if there isn't any. Right? And I like to do something called zooming during the exposure. Okay. Has anybody ever tried this? Just stick your hand up if you've ever done this before. Typically it works well on certain subjects. Sharana has. Okay, cool. You can put your hand down. So this will be new for some of you, which is awesome. So it works really well on scenes that have lights, because what you're going to do is do a long exposure. I'll give you the specs on how to do it. Okay, so it's going to be a second or two long or longer, and zoom your lens during the exposure. So obviously the key is you need to have a zoom lens. It's not going to work if you have your 50 prime on, okay? But scenes with lights in them work really well because the lights kind of zoom out. I'll show you some examples. Okay, these are some tips for you. So if you're going to zoom, make sure that you start zoomed in. So if you're using, for example, an 18 to 50 mil lens, start it at 50, focus, and then actually turn your focus off on your lens. So switch it to manual. Okay, I haven't put that in the notes, my apologies. Switch it to manual, and then during your exposure, you kind of have to practice. You have to know which way the lens is going to turn, and it takes a little practice to do it smoothly, okay, but you're going to zoom out. So you're going to zoom from 55 to 18 in this particular case. Okay, the reason that you want to do this is that focus is more critical on the zoomed in parts. That's where you want to focus. So experiment with different speeds. And you'll get a completely different picture. I'll show you some examples. If you have, let's say you're doing a 3-second exposure and you do 1 second at the beginning zoomed in, and then you slowly zoom out and you do the rest at the end, versus let's say you do 2 seconds at the beginning and you zoom out quickly to 1 second at the end. You'll get a completely different looking picture. Right? So experiment. Again, it's another one of those things where there is no right or wrong. It's all about playing with it and seeing what you can come up with. This is one of the really fun techniques I like to play with in night photography. Okay. Ideally, you want your exposure to be around 2 seconds or so, because if you're trying to zoom and your exposure is shorter, you have less time to manipulate the lens. Okay, so you obviously need to be on a tripod for this, and it has to be steady. Okay. Here's an example. Just give me a quick show of hands. Who does not have a tripod? Stick your hand up if you do not have a tripod. Looks like most people do. Okay, cool, awesome. Then you guys are going to be good with the homework today. Okay, so this is the Brooklyn Bridge. Where's my New Yorker? That's Sheila, right? So this is kind of in your neighborhood down there. This is Brooklyn Bridge, and I wanted to do something different. So when you get to something iconic like this, or the Eiffel Tower, someplace that has been photographed a million times before, try and do something a little bit different. This was my version of it. You'll see a few shots of the bridge. Okay, this is San Francisco again. This is in the lobby of the Hyatt Hotel, and I wanted to show you this one because this is prior to zooming. So if you look up, there's some lights hanging from the ceiling, and you sort of see them in rows, and there's a funny looking sculpture. I don't know if you guys can see this in the bottom left. That's going to come up a little bit later, but there's kind of this brass looking sculpture thing in the background there. So this is what the scene looked like, just as it was. Okay. Once I incorporated some zooming into it, then it started to change the picture, and we started to have jump to hyperspeed, right? So if you've watched Star Wars or Star Trek, now we're off into light space. And just by changing the speed of which I'm zooming, we get a completely different picture. Okay, so there's a different look, and one more. Okay, so those are all the same subject, completely different. You have no idea what it is. It's become completely abstract. And it's just a really fun kind of thing. I really love to do this kind of thing and experiment. And when you show this kind of stuff, this is the kind of thing that people are going to start to say, wow, how did you do that? That's a photograph? No, you painted it or some other technique. Okay, so when you start to do things that are a little bit different than the normal person is going to do with their point and shoot or take on their smartphone, you'll start to get your pictures noticed a bit more as different. So here's that funny sculpture thing in the background that I mentioned. Here it is without any zooming, or a small amount of zooming. And this is what it looked like after I did a large amount of zoom. So I've punched up the colors a little bit in Lightroom and enhanced them so that it's a little bit more saturated. But you can also see that the zooming effect has totally provided an abstract effect for it. And there's another version. So just a slightly different angle, and I'm producing a slightly different version. It was also rotating and changing colors as it went. Let's see, we have a question. You have a question, Sharana?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, they're really cool. And in all those, again, are you going from like, whatever, from the bigger to the smaller, like from a 50 to 18 focal length?
Yes, always that way. So always bigger focal length to smaller. Correct. Good question.
Thank you.
What does everybody else think of this technique? Is this something that you can do? Let's see, hands up. Can you guys do this? This is not hard, right? Paula, did you have a question, or you're just saying yes? Everybody's like, yes, they can do this. Perfect. You guys got this. Okay. Okay, so the next part of the exposure triangle is the aperture. Okay, so I want to see hands up for who wants to define what the aperture is. I see Sharana again. Sharana? Go ahead.
Oh, hi. Yeah, it's how small or big the opening is. The smaller the opening, then the sharper the image will be. And then if it's a wider aperture, like a 2.8, it's going to be more shallow.
Okay, you're getting way ahead of me in terms of that, but that's, yes, you're on the right track. You're on the right track, though. Perfect.
I'm sorry.
You've just provided more information than we needed, but yes, you're on the right track. No worries. Okay, so the aperture itself is actually the opening. So it doesn't matter actually whether it's big or small, it's just the physical opening. So think in terms of an analogy to your eyeball, it is your pupil. Okay, so when you step outside, your pupil goes, if you're in the sun, your pupil becomes very small because it's restricting the amount of light coming in. When you step inside into a dark room, it opens up. So your lens has the same capability. Okay, so unlike the aperture and the shutter speed, which are dependent on the functions inside the camera body, the aperture is dependent on the actual lens itself. So every lens has a different aperture range. Okay? You'll often hear the aperture referred to as the f number or an f-stop. Okay, so if somebody says, what f number did you shoot that at? That means what aperture did you shoot it at? Okay, okay, so what does it control? Sharana kind of already hinted at that. Does anybody want to know, does anybody know the term for what she was talking about, a lot of focus or a little focus? Anybody know that term? That's a funny abbreviation. Okay, it's called depth of field. Okay, so you'll often see it abbreviated as DOF, and it was exactly what Sharana described. You either have a small amount of your picture in focus or you have a lot in focus, and it has to do with how deep the focus goes from the point of focus. So if you focus on something 5 feet from you, do you have from 6 to 7 or from 5 to 7 feet, or do you have from 2 feet to 20 feet in focus? Right? So how deep is your focus range? You know, this is where it starts to get a little bit confusing, especially if you're new to photography and shooting with SLRs. The smaller the number is the smaller depth of field. Okay, so f1.8 has a small or a shallow depth of field. f22 has a large depth of field. Okay, so if you keep in your mind the number itself is sort of equal to the amount of the depth of field or the amount of focus. So I like to tell my students that imagine you have a row of fence posts and you want 3 of them in focus. Imagine you need to shoot at f3. If you want 10 of them in focus, you need to shoot at f10. Okay, so now that's not reality. Those are just, you know, representing, but it gives you an idea on what you can have to help you remember that to get more of the fence in focus, you need a bigger number. Okay. So there's a little chart here, and this will come on your homework as well. So you can print this out with your homework, carry it in your camera bag if you want, to help you understand the relationship between the size of the aperture. So it's kind of over the guy's bum here, right? So the size of the aperture, the number on the scale, and how much is in focus. So at the top, we can see that f2.8 is a large opening, and you see only the little boy with the balloon in focus. At the bottom, we see f22 is a tiny opening, and we see pretty much the whole range, all the way from the photographer to the background in focus. Okay, so hopefully that chart will help you get it in your heads how those things work together. So here's a representation of what the fellow was doing in the little infographic. So depth of field at 1.8 versus depth of field at f22. So there's that one fence post versus the whole fence in focus. So I'm just going to keep going until we have any hands up here. I'm assuming you guys know all this stuff. So you don't have to answer this. So one of the things I find that why it's so confusing is because the number is small and the opening is big, and that's where people get confused. So hopefully I'm going to give you a little tip if it's something that you're often having to stop and think about that will make it a little more clear for you. So think of an aperture like a ratio, okay? So it's actually a fraction. It's actually the focal length of the lens divided by the opening in the actual lens, the diameter, okay? So that's the mathematical equation of the aperture, okay? And so that's why you see that f slash a number. So let's think of it in a different way. So rather this arbitrary strange number, and they don't go up in any range that looks normal. You go from 1 to 1.4 to 2.8, and it just doesn't make any sense, okay? So let's think of it in terms of this. If you have a half of something, which is bigger, a half or an eighth? Okay? If we have a pie, obviously a half of a pie is bigger than an eighth of a pie. Okay? Everybody with me? So when we go and talk about the f number, just replace the 1 in the fraction with the f. Think of it in terms of a fraction or a ratio. So which is bigger? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Based on the pie, which is bigger, f2 or f8? Dina. Dina, go ahead.
I'm guessing it's F2.
You are absolutely
I'm guessing it's
correct.
F2.
You are absolutely correct. Was that helpful for you?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I do think it's helpful.
Okay, cool. Okay, so f2 is definitely bigger. Okay? You are always correct there. So the exposure triangle, then, putting it all together, is those three pieces that we just looked at: the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture, and they work together. I like to describe it sort of as a three-way teeter-totter, and they have this little balancing act. So if you imagine a funny little three-way teeter-totter, triangle, if you will, balanced in the middle, and keeping it balanced, not touching the ground, can happen in any number of ways. So you can put the three together in multiple combinations of ways. And where it gets kind of confusing is, okay, well, what do I choose when? And you feel like you're, spinning on the merry-go-round, not the teeter-totter, right? So I found this wonderful little infographic on exposureguide.com, and they were nice enough to let me use it. So this will be in your video. You can see this, and it gives a really nice representation of the three pieces of the exposure triangle that we just talked about. So the ISO, and see it controls noise up in the top triangle. The aperture controls the depth of field. There's that DOF, and the shutter speed controls the motion. Okay, we haven't talked about EV yet. We'll come to that in a little bit when we talk about the actual exposure and metering. Okay. Okay, so shooting modes. There are several shooting modes on most cameras. These are the ones that are generally used by professionals or people that are moving away from sort of the auto settings. Okay, so if you're using the auto settings, that's absolutely fine. And I even tell this in my, especially in beginner class, if you're using auto settings now and you're trying to move over into having more control and learning what these do, try not to overload yourself and get overwhelmed with, okay, I have to shoot in manual because, so-and-so said that's the best way to do it, and I have to do that or I'm not doing it right. So don't get hung up too much on that. Learn it at your own pace and gradually move over into shooting into these modes. Okay, so what they stand for is P is program, M is manual, A is aperture priority. If you're using a Canon, you'll see it represented as AV, S is shutter priority, or TV if you're on Canon. Okay? So that's the whole confusion. What do I choose? So now we have all these options. The cameras, when I started photography, had way less options. With film, you put your film in, you set your shutter speed and your aperture, and that was it. There was no modes, there wasn't autofocus, it was simple. Okay? So the cameras that we use now are much more complex, and there's a lot to them. Okay? So don't worry so much if it's a little bit overwhelming. Take it piece by piece. Okay, so shooting dial, you'll see something probably similar to this. If you're on a Canon, you'll see something like the one on the left, Nikon on the right. If you're using something other than those two brands, it's going to be probably something similar, okay? So you'll notice that there's several other options. You'll see like the little icons, the face, the mountain, the flower, looks like a guy running, okay? So those are sort of scenes that you can choose. Those are all auto settings, okay? So on the other side of on a Canon dial, it's a green auto mode. Generally, on the other side of auto or on the other side of the manual modes is all the auto settings. So you'll see the lady's face is portrait, the mountain scene is landscape style, the flowers macro, the guy running is sports, the person with the star is night portraits, and then of course video if your camera does video. Okay, so all of those things can be replicated in the other side on manual once you know how they go together. So these are the common shooting modes that I mentioned earlier. So program, if you have a little chart you can make for yourself, program allows you to control, of the three pieces of the exposure triangle, you can control just the ISO. The camera will pick the aperture and the shutter speed for you. Okay. When you're in manual mode, it's complete opposite. You are choosing all three pieces. Okay, so the camera doesn't choose anything. So if you don't set it to make a correct exposure, you will have a dark or a bright picture. Okay? In program mode, it will generally compensate and you'll have a correct exposure no matter what. Okay? AV mode or aperture mode and shutter mode they're auto modes, but they're often used by professionals. Most commonly, I use the aperture priority myself, and it has to do with what is your priority, obviously. Okay, so generally, I like to use aperture priority because that fits into my style of the shallow depth of field that I like to do. Aperture priority allows you to control two pieces of that triangle. So you get to choose the ISO, you get to choose the aperture. Okay? The camera then chooses the correct shutter speed to allow to make a correct exposure. And we'll talk about what is correct. Okay? Shutter priority is just the opposite. You control the ISO and the shutter speed. The camera will then choose an aperture to give you a correct exposure. Okay? So what to choose? Okay? So here's a little cheat sheet for you. Shutter mode for moving objects. So remember when we were doing the panning earlier, I talked about panning, I was choosing shutter priority mode because I want to control motion and moving objects. So that would be a case when I'm going to choose shutter priority. Aperture priority for static objects where you want to control the depth of field, so such as a portrait or something where you want the background out of focus or you want lots of focus. Manual mode, I use manual mode mostly when I want things consistent. So if I'm doing, say, a portrait where the subjects aren't moving, I'm not moving, the light is not changing, everything is the same, then I'm probably going to do manual. Okay. If I'm doing things like off-camera flash, I'm going to do manual. That's a little more advanced. And if you have time to fuss with the settings, quite honestly, if you've got something going by and you just want to capture a portrait or capture a picture of a motorcyclist going by, and you don't want to fiddle with the manual mode because you might miss the exposure, stick it in one of the others, stick it in aperture mode or put it in program and just get the shot, right? So gradually move over into using more of these modes and less of the others, but don't be afraid to use them when necessary, right? Aperture mode, there's nothing wrong with it, and I know that most professionals use those modes as well, right? As I mentioned, use the program mode when you want to get a shot fast and you don't have time to sort of think about your settings. You want to just take a grab shot, right? You're photographing your kids or your grandkids or your pet and they're doing something really cute and you pick up your camera. You don't have time to figure out what you're doing. Just stick it on the P mode and you'll be fine. And no, P does not stand for professional. Brenda has her hand up. Did you have a question, Brenda?
Well, then what is the difference, I guess, you're saying on P, because then I'd have to pick the ISO versus just auto.
Right. So auto chooses everything for you, including the ISO. So with program, you choose the ISO. So that little thing we did at the beginning where, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. There's not a huge difference between full auto and program. It just gives you control of one piece of the puzzle. Does that make sense?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. Okay, so these are my steps for choosing your exposure. This will be in your handout as well, so like a little cheat sheet for you. You can print out and take into the field. So these are the steps that I go through when I'm going to decide what mode I'm going to shoot and how am I going to approach this subject. So number one, I choose my ISO. So that's going to be based on the lighting conditions. By lighting conditions, I mean how much is there. Am I in a darkened room or am I outdoor in the bright sun? Okay, so general rule of thumb, if I'm outdoors in the bright sun, I'm going to be at a low ISO somewhere 100 to 400. If I'm inside, I'm probably going to be somewhere between 400 and 1600. Okay, if I'm in a really dark room, it's probably going to be higher than that. Okay, I've done some events where they've actually asked me not to use flash. It was a religious ceremony of sorts, and I was using 12,000 ISO with a fast lens. We'll cover that as well, so that I wasn't disrupting the ceremony with a flash. Okay, and because my camera can handle that high ISO, I can get away with that. Okay, so I choose my ISO first, always trying to keep it as low as I can to keep the noise level down in my pictures. Okay, that changes the quality of my pictures. Then I choose the shooting mode. Okay, so what is important to me? Is freezing or blurring something important to me, or is creating some depth of field choices? Okay, so let's go to number 3. So let's say I decide, okay, I want to blur something. I want to do some panning, or I want to blur an object that's going by. So I'm going to choose the shutter priority mode. Okay, so S on a Nikon, TV on a Canon. If I'm doing a portrait, I'm most likely going to be in aperture priority mode. If I'm walking around just doing a tour of a city or something, I'm usually in aperture priority mode using my largest aperture. That just tends to be my style. Okay. If I'm in a darkened room, I'll probably be in aperture priority with my biggest aperture as well. Okay. Lastly, adjust as necessary. So start with that and see how it looks. If you're not getting a fast enough shutter speed because we want to be that 1 over your focal length, you might have to increase the ISO accordingly because there's that teeter-totter. So all of them have a little teeter-totter. So shutter speed and aperture, if one goes up, the other goes down. The same thing with ISO. So if you need your shutter speed to go up, you have to up the ISO the other direction. Okay, white balance. Does anybody know what white balance is? I know a lot of people still use the auto white balance, which is just fine. Does anybody want to define white balance? No brave takers? Okay. So what is it? And why is it important? So the white balance is actually the color of the lighting, okay? So yes, you can use auto white balance, and you'll see it abbreviated as AWB. You'll see white balance abbreviated as WB, and there's probably a button or a setting in your menu to adjust it. A lot of people in my classes have never taken it off auto white balance. They didn't know how to change it, okay, or why you would want to change it. So I'll show you some examples of different settings for white balance. So light itself has a color cast. So it's called a spectrum of light. If you have a beam of sun that goes through, say, a prism, like if you have one of those little glass things, you'll see the light separated into almost like a rainbow, okay? So color of light is very similar to that. So if you think about putting, it's called degrees Kelvin, which is a weird word, and it comes from a heated body, a heated black body. So imagine you have a cast iron pot and you put it on your stove, okay? If you heat it with a fire, okay, and it gets hot, it starts to turn maybe orange, okay? If it gets really hot, now we're talking about people that are forging metal and so on, what happens? They start to glow white and blue. So the hotter it is, the bluer it is. Okay, so this is kind of representative of that scale. It's very similar to that. It's almost like a heat scale. Okay, and on the right hand side of the scale, you'll see the lighting that kind of matches those numbers. Okay, so candlelight is very warm. So if you put a candle on, it's very orange. Tungsten or a daylight, tungsten or like a regular household light bulb is tungsten, is very yellow. You're moving up into daylight or flash is a little bit on the blue side. Getting into the shade is really blue, and then the night sky is extra blue. Okay, what that means in terms of when we're photographing is we want to keep our pictures looking neutral most of the time, right? If you're photographing somebody in the shade, you don't want them to be blue. If you're photographing them with a candlelight, you don't want them to be orange, right? So you want your pictures to be neutral. So what the settings on your camera do is they actually counterbalance them opposite. Okay, so the opposite of blue is the orange or yellow, and the opposite of orange is blue. Okay, so these are typical settings that you'll see on your camera. Right, the auto, custom, incandescent or tungsten, fluorescent, sunlight, flash, cloudy, shade. And some cameras have something called a K, so that's that Kelvin setting that I was talking about, that actually allows you to dial it in with any number from usually 1,000 or 1,500 all the way up to 10,000. So it gives you kind of a neat flexibility. Right? So what I'm going to give you as part of your assignment this week is to play around with your white balance settings if you haven't done so. So here's an example. Okay, so here's a scene that I was at a medieval festival recently, a little medieval thing that these people put on. This was in an indoor hall, so the lighting was kind of yucky. Actually, it was fluorescent and tungsten mixed together, so kind of yuck. So this is what auto white balance did. Knowing that this is a silver headpiece, it should be neutral. Okay, so it's got some color cast to it. So I changed it a little bit. So I did what's called a custom white balance. Okay, so if you have something white or people carry a gray card, you can do a custom white balance off of something that's neutral. If you're not sure how to do that, check your camera manual. So you set the custom white balance and you change your camera to that setting, and it's now neutralized any color cast in that scene. So as long as you're photographing within that same scene, all your pictures should be the right color cast. Okay, so it's neutralizing any color cast. Okay, I tried one with fluorescent because there was fluorescent light. It still had a lot of yellow in it because of the other tungsten lights, so it wasn't doing a great job. I tried daylight. That certainly wasn't very good. Okay, so just show of hands, has anybody ever gotten a picture that was overly blue or overly yellow by accident? Because I'm sure we've all done that, and I have as well. Yes, of course. Okay, so this is what's happening is the white balance was on the wrong setting. Okay, now if you are shooting JPEGs, that's going to be a big issue, because if you've shot a JPEG that looks like this, you might as well almost turn it black and white, because it's very difficult to correct a really strong color cast with a JPEG. If you are shooting RAW, it's very easy to correct it, because those options that you have in the camera, you also have in the software. Let me just see a show of hands. Who is shooting RAW files? We have 1, 2, 3, couple, 4. Okay, cool. Okay, I may ask more about processing later. So for those of you that aren't shooting RAW, Omar, okay, great. Oh, Omar has joined us. Awesome. Okay, so for those of you that aren't shooting RAW, you don't necessarily have to jump in and do that right now. Generally, what I find with a lot of my students is that the process goes something like this. They buy an SLR, they start shooting in auto. Then they decide, okay, I've got this fancy camera, I want to learn how to use the darn thing. So then they take a class, something like what we're doing, or a local class to learn about the mechanics of the camera and the settings. Then from there, they decide, okay, now I want to have a little more control over the processing. So the difference really between shooting a JPEG and the RAW is that instead of having the camera process it and apply the settings, you're doing it in the software. So once you get to the point where you're comfortable with your camera and you decide you want to take more control back, you're probably going to look at processing software. Okay, metering modes. I'm not going to spend too much time on these because every camera is slightly different, but there are generally a few metering modes that are built into your camera. Okay, so metering modes are how does your camera look at the scene and measure the light that's coming in. Okay, so evaluative or matrix, depending on what cameras you have, generally looks at the entire scene and does an average. Okay? Most of the time, this is where I would leave it, and it's going to give you a pretty good exposure most of the time. Right? Center weighted is just that. So imagine you have a circle in the middle of your picture that takes about 50% of the screen. That's what center weighted is going to do. So it's not going to consider the outside edges of the picture and how much light is there, just the center. Okay? Partial is similar to center, but it's a little bit smaller, and it has to do with where you're focusing. So center is generally always in the center. Partial may be off to the side if your focus dot is off to the side. Okay? So if you're focusing off to the left a little bit, you'll be metering where you're focusing. Okay? Spot metering is generally a really tiny area, so that's why they call it spot metering. It might even be a 3-degree spot where you're doing a precise meter reading on one little area. So I don't recommend using spot meter reading until you're really comfortable with how your camera meter works and you know how to adjust it, because it can go wrong quickly. Okay? So most of the time, you're probably going to be in evaluative or matrix. Okay, so has anybody ever taken a picture, then the camera set the exposure and it came out and it was either too dark or too light and you thought there was something wrong with your camera? Let me see a show of hands. Couple? Okay, lots, okay. So I said this in my classes that, okay, you might as well throw your camera out, it's broken. And I was just kidding. It's not broken. So the thing with the camera meter, okay, is that this is how it works. So it measures the light bouncing off of your subject. So imagine that my webcam is the camera, which in this case, of course, it is. So if it's metering me, it's measuring the amount of light hitting me and coming back into the aperture of the lens. Okay, so there's potential problems with that. Right? If I'm wearing a white shirt or a dark shirt, it's going to be fooled, because if I'm wearing a white shirt, I'm going to bounce more light back than if I'm wearing a black shirt, okay? But the lighting on me hasn't changed. So it's called reflective meter reading is what your camera does, and it's reflected light bouncing back into the camera. Okay? It's also tricked by strong backlighting. So if I had the sun behind me, that's another situation where your camera meter is going to go, oh, there's lots of light, and it's going to make probably a dark picture where the background is levelly exposed and your person is black. Okay, so if you wanted a silhouette, that's great, but if you wanted a picture of the person, that's not so great. Okay? So the camera meter just provides you with a meter reading, and it's a measurement of how much light there is. You have to know how to interpret it. Okay. So now this one, I want to know what everybody thinks about this one. Your camera measures for 18% gray. Has anybody heard of that before? Or is this more of the case? Hands up if you can relate to that. Okay, cool. Okay, so we have a few say whats. What does that mean? Okay, so 18% gray. So imagine we have your tones going from black to very light. Okay, now I've put the numbers in here. 0 is black, 255 is white. That has to do with measuring the tones, okay, and measuring the tones digitally. So 255 is pure white, 0 is black. Okay, so medium gray is obviously in the middle, and it's called 18% gray. If you go into a camera store, you'll see things called gray cards. Okay, they're made for two things. You can do metering off of them, and you can also do color balance off of them. If you have a good one, it's color neutral, and you'll be able to color balance and do a custom white balance, like I described earlier. Okay, so how do we use that information? Okay, so imagine we have a correct exposure. Okay, so let's say our correct exposure is a full glass of water. And I like to give a little analogy here. So imagine we've taken our glass to the bathroom tap or the kitchen tap. And we have a number of different ways how we can fill that. We could open the tap up fully, okay, so that's going to be a large aperture. Stick the glass in, the water is going to be flowing quickly because of the big opening, and we only need maybe a couple of seconds to fill the glass, right? The other option, and there's obviously a range in between there, is we open the tap just to a trickle or maybe even a drip, and we put the glass there and we come back in a few hours. Okay, so we can still get a full glass of water, but now we have a very small aperture. So the water's coming in at a very slow rate, like it would with small aperture like f22 or f32, and consequently we need a longer exposure time. Okay, so does that make sense how that teeter-totter works? Hands up if anybody just had an aha moment. Okay, so imagine overexposure is the water is flowing over the glass. So if we have too much light, we have overflowed the glass. Okay? If we have not enough light, we don't have a full glass of water. Okay? So correct is our full glass. That's what we're going to call correct. Okay? So how do we know what is correct? Okay, it depends is the actual answer. And there's a tool that comes with your camera. It's called a histogram. Even little point-and-shoot cameras often have these, sometimes even on the display while you're shooting. Okay, so I want to see show of hands. Who uses their histogram? Couple, Kit, awesome. Paula, is that a question or hands up? We've got a few hands up. Okay, I'm going to put your hands down, and if you have another question, just put your hand back up. Okay. So the histogram, there's that pure black to pure white again. Okay, the histogram is basically a bar graph just representing the number of pixels in each tone. So the further up it goes on the bar graph, it's tiny little bar graphs. Imagine 255 bar graphs all joined together. So that 0 to 255, that's what your histogram is representing. Okay, so the higher the spike, the more tones there are, the more pixels there are in that tone. Okay, so in this one here, there's a lot of light tones in whatever picture this represents. Okay, so things to look for when you're looking at your histogram. Your histogram tells you a lot about your exposure. Okay, so does anybody know what the one on the left is telling me? What does it tell me about my exposure? Well, I'm gonna go to Olivia. Yes, Olivia.
That it's too dark?
It's too dark, right? So in this particular case, it's actually quite underexposed. So what she's talking about is this space here. So notice all the pixels are pushed off to the left-hand side, which is the dark area. There's nothing going from about medium gray to white. Okay, so every scene should have a range from dark to light. And a lot of times you'll hear, okay, you need to have a perfect arch going from dark to light and nothing off the end in a perfect world, but that doesn't always apply. So the thing you want to look for is the gap. So in this one here, you notice there's a space between where the pixels end and the right-hand side of the graph. So that means there's a lot more room to move the exposure up, okay, before we have overexposure. Did Olivia have another question? Did you have another question, Olivia?
No.
Okay, your hand was up. Okay, no problem. Okay, so then the one on the right is the opposite of what we just had. Okay, so now this one is overexposed. You can see that all the pixels are pushed off to the left-hand side. I'm probably backwards on the video, just ignore me. All the pixels are pushed up to the left-hand side, and we have a gap on the right. Okay, so we have the underexposure and the overexposure. Okay, so another thing that's handy on most cameras is something called the highlight alert. Many people fondly call it the blinkies. So there's a setting in your menu. In Nikon, I believe it's a highlight alert, and you have to turn it on. You want the exposure one only, not necessarily the RGB one in terms of your histogram, and you want the highlight alert on. Okay, so what that does is anything that you see flashing, like in this picture on the screen, means that it's overexposed off the chart. Okay, so anything that's flashing is not going to have any detail whatsoever. So in this scene, it looks like it's a snowy scene. We want to have some detail in our snow. If you're taking a picture of a person and that's their face, not so much good, right? So it just gives you a hint of what is overexposing. Okay? So some tips for reading your histogram. This is in your notes as well, so you can print it out. Do not trust the camera's playback screen. Okay, your camera screen is like your computer screen. It can be adjusted darker and brighter. So especially when you're outdoors and you can't see it very well, you might adjust it brighter, or you might have it in auto adjust, and it may fool you to thinking that your exposure is good and it's really not. Okay, so don't trust the visual look of it. Okay, watch for the clipped highlights. So you can see the clipped highlights. Clipping means off the end, right, of the graph, right, going up the side on the right, or flashing highlights. Watch for those because it's really hard to pull those back, especially if you're shooting a JPEG. Right? However, I'm going to back up to the highlights again. If you see something that's flashing and your highlights are clipped in an area that you don't care about, okay, so if you're taking a picture of that person again and they're backlit, and the background is flashing but their face is not, that's where you make that judgment decision of that's what I want. Okay, so you don't care if there's detail in the background, you want detail in the person. Okay? Look for the gaps on either side and indicating that you have more room to go to your exposure one way or the other. Okay? And does it represent the scene accurately? Okay, so what I mean by that is your camera wants to make everything gray. Okay, so take a look at this scene. So now we're looking at a snowy scene again. Yes, this is what Edmonton looks like. This is where I live. This is what it looks like in the winter. So for those of you that live someplace warm, come and visit in January. You'll see this. So look at the histogram that goes with this picture. So I shot just as way the camera asked me to. It comes out looking gray, and the histogram represents a lot of pixels, mostly in the middle. Okay, knowing what we know about this scene, that's not correct though, because it should be white. Right? So I've compensated by doing something called exposure compensation. So if you're using aperture priority or shutter priority, your camera's always going to try and set it to 0, which means gray. Right? So you can use something called exposure compensation on your camera. It's that little plus and minus button to set it for plus if you want more light, minus if you want less. Right? If you're shooting in manual and you're seeing the little scale down the bottom and you're inside your viewfinder, manual to 0 sets it to gray, plus gives it lighter, minus gives it darker. Okay? So here's the opposite problem or challenge. We have a dark subject. So once again, the camera has made it gray. Okay? This was our kitty Boo. She's no longer with us, but we have lots of great pictures of her. So now I've gone to -1 1/3 to compensate to make her black. Okay, so when you look at the histogram, it's not underexposed, it's actually exposed correctly because the scene is mostly dark. Okay? You don't see a lot of light stuff in the scene, and it's representing it quite well. Okay, I see a hand up. Did you have a question, Olivia?
Yeah, so when would you use exposure compensation rather than just changing the other 3? That's what I don't get.
Okay, so exposure compensation. So describe to me, what do you mean by changing the other 3? Like just changing my ISO?
Yeah.
Okay, so when you're in, say, aperture priority mode, okay, you set your ISO. Let's say we've set my ISO to 400. It's done. It's finished. Okay. So when you change your aperture, the camera changes your shutter speed to keep it set to 0 to make gray. Okay. So if I change my aperture, it's going to compensate with the shutter speed to still keep it gray. So no matter what I do, it's still going to give me gray. Okay. So when you go to the exposure compensation, now you're telling it, no, I want more light than what you're giving me, or I want less light than what you're giving me. So you're actually changing the amount of water in the glass.
Okay, cool.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Good question. Thank you. Okay. Any questions about that last section? We're going to move on to lenses. What are we doing here? Good. Okay. I want to move through here. No questions. Beautiful. Okay, so lenses. So today we're going to also talk about lenses, and this will be part of your homework too, is to play with them. If you don't have a really wide lens, not to worry about it. Use what you have. If you have a friend that has one, maybe you can borrow one, or hook up. Maybe you can rent one if that's something that's feasible for you. Otherwise, just use the widest one that you have. Okay. So wide lenses exaggerate perspective and scale. So in this particular case, we see the old tractor and the grain elevator. So for those of you not familiar with prairie landscape, grain elevators are large things. They're large buildings on the prairies. So take a look at this. You can use your fingers and measure them, okay? Look at the tractor is larger in the picture than the grain elevator. Okay, so when you shoot with a really wide lens, things that are closer to the camera appear larger. Just like if you're driving and your side mirror has one of those little magnifying things on your car and it says objects are closer than they appear. Similar, okay? So the objects that come forward towards the lens of a wide angle lens may appear larger. So you get this weird size perspective, and things in the background look really, really small. Okay? So this one was done with a 17mm lens on my full frame camera. If you do not have a full frame camera, if you're not sure, you can either ask me that question or, based on your camera model, or general rule of thumb is if you didn't pay $2,000 or more for it, you probably don't have a full frame sensor. Okay, so most people don't, and I actually don't recommend getting one unless you're wanting to do it seriously or professionally. Most people really don't need one. It's not an issue. They make lenses for crop sensor that work just fine. So I've put the equivalent down below. If you have a crop sensor, that's about a 12mm lens, so really wide. Okay, you can only go slightly wider than that before you get into what's called a fisheye, which has distortion, and really big distortion on the edges, and you start seeing almost a circle. So same scene, now we see the tractor and the grain elevator. It has not moved. So I've moved back, it's in the same spot, and I'm using a longer lens to capture it. Okay, so at 75mm on my full frame, 50 on a cropped. Okay, so what that's doing now is change the size relationship. Okay, the perspective is more compressed. They look like they're a lot closer together, right? So they're the same distance apart there as there. Right? Slightly different camera angle, but it gives you a totally different perspective. Right? Now you see the scale of the grain elevators a little bit better. Brenda knows what I'm talking about. Okay, so I'm going to show you some examples of wide-angle lens pictures, okay, and when you might want to use them. So some neat things about wide angles is because of that, once you know what they do in terms of the optics, you want to use that to your advantage. So it enhances perspective. So when you're using a wide-angle lens and you're choosing a subject, or your subject is choosing your lens, if something is coming forward like this dock, I really wanted the dock to come towards me and that lifesaver, life preserver thing to seem larger than life, and the buildings in the background recede. It's helped out by the fact that it's foggy and they really have receded. Okay, so things closer appear larger and feel like they're jumping into the camera. Right, it makes you feel like you're really part of the scene when you're doing a wide-angle picture. Okay, here's another one. This is done your neighborhood, Omar, down in New York City. So it's looking straight up, and this is, for me, like quintessential New York, right? You see buildings everywhere. No matter where you are, you look up and you see buildings. So this is so wide. This is a 15mm fisheye that I actually rented from a store in New York when I was there. Okay, so you can do some really neat things with accentuating that perspective. Okay. Notice the sign here. So the sign that's closest to me on the left-hand side, the B, it looks much bigger than the other B. Okay, they're the same size, right? The letters are all the same size. It's that perspective with the wide again. Okay, it's shifting. Okay, there's the Brooklyn Bridge again. This is the 15, super wide. And you start to see what is happening on the edges. It starts to look circular. So the wider you go, it starts to look circular. If you go one more wider than this to a 13 or a 14, you actually have a circle. Okay? And there are lenses that produce a circle. Okay? Similar spot. This is a fellow I met on the bridge. I like meeting people. He was a Russian student. It was his last day in New York. He's going home to Russia. We struck up a conversation and I took his photo. Okay? We may come back to talk about him when we get into photographing people later on in the course. Okay, so some example pictures from long lenses as a comparison. Okay, so long lenses compress perspective. So notice here we have some trees that are in the foreground. So the foreground is closer to us, right? We have the bride, which is in the middle, and the door, which is in the background. Right? Now, Rob knows sort of my history. Wherever we travel, I seem to run into wedding photo shoots. Just seems to be my thing. So I tend to always take a picture of the bride. She didn't know I was taking her photo. Okay, so it compresses them so that they look like they're all on the same level. Okay, and what it does is it also gives you a lot more way to put your foreground and your background out of focus. So notice how out of focus in this case the front leaves are. Okay, okay, so now this is a 300mm lens on my full frame, 200 on the cropped sensor. Okay, so in some respect, the crop sensors actually have an advantage because if you want to do birds or wildlife, okay, if you have a 200 or a 300, you have a longer lens than I do. Okay? Currently, my longest is 200, so I don't have anything long enough really to do wildlife. So if you have a 200 or 300, you can go out and do wildlife. This was not done with a really big aperture. Okay, the lens that I had at the time was a 28 to 300 Tamron lens, and the maximum aperture at 300 was actually 6.3. Okay, So 6.3 is not really big, and it's still, the background is out of focus for two factors. Number one, it's really far away, and number two, because of the length of the lens. So if you want to get that really out of focus background, use a longer lens, right? And make sure that the background is really far away like this. Okay? It's very hard to get this look. It's almost impossible with a wide lens. Okay? Same thing again, portraits, I'm often using a longer lens. Okay, so now for people specifically, we're going to do some comparisons, and you guys get to try this at home this week. So let's look at her face in the wide lens, various other lenses up to the 150. So 16 is pretty wide. She's sitting in the same spot for all of the pictures, and they're all taken with the same aperture. Right? Nothing has changed. The background hasn't gotten farther away. They're all the same. But notice in the longer lens, the background is more blurry. And look at what happens to her face in the wide. Anybody notice what's happening to her face? Right? She looks kind of distorted, right? So there's that closer to the lens thing, looks bigger, right? So when taking pictures of friends often at parties, I'm always giving my mother heck for this because she has a real point and shoot camera and she comes right into your face with a wide angle lens. And I'm always saying, Mother, please step back and zoom in because it'll be a more flattering picture of the person when you step back and use a longer lens. Okay? People forget that you have another zoom, and that's your feet. So here's another example. So a 20mm lens. Okay, this one I've also taken a lower camera angle. So I'm actually down below her, and you can kind of see up her nose, which is not real flattering. So a little bit of a people tip there. So you see the whole room, really. In the longer lens, I'm stepped back quite a bit. I still see her about the same size. So notice her face is about the same size, okay? Maybe a little bigger here, but it's much more flattering. Okay? So for people, it's more flattering to use a longer lens. Okay? There are cases when you want to use a wide lens, maybe you're photographing kids or you want to do something comical or humorous, then by all means, a wide lens is going to be appropriate. Okay, so what lens to buy next? Zoom versus prime. Does anybody have questions about what lens to buy next? And I'll just address them directly because this is something I get all the time in my classes. I don't know what to buy. What should I buy? No questions? You guys all have all the lenses you need? Oh, Sharana. Okay, awesome. Okay, go, Sharana.
Oh, hi, thank you. Yeah, I think I mentioned this to you once, darling. Well, my primary is 18 to 200 on my crop sensor.
Okay.
And, well, basically, I like the lens. But I was thinking of a wide angle because I like the feeling that the viewer seems to get that they're really almost next to, or I mean, they're in the photograph because the foreground seems so close.
Exactly.
So, but then the background, I like the perspective difference between the foreground and the background. You get like, really wide perspective, but then everything in the background seems so teeny. I do primarily landscape photography right now, though I'm interested in other photography, but the one I was looking at also had a variable aperture. Well, that brings in another issue, so maybe I won't get into that, but that's part of it. So I really wasn't thinking, I was seriously thinking of it, but then I started thinking maybe I really didn't have a need for a wide angle lens. Also, they're very expensive, but I did like the feeling of the viewer really being into it, the different perspective.
Okay. And so your question is, should you get one, or which one should you get, or what is your question?
Well, I guess I'll keep it simple first. Can you tell me what I like it? Can you read?
Ooh, that's a tough question. I mean, I tend to live on both ends of the spectrum. I tend to like really wide or really long. So most of the time, I'm kind of shooting at extremes. I do obviously in the middle as well, and I have some primes. But the thing about the zoom lens versus a prime is you'll always pay more for a zoom lens, and you'll probably not get as big of an aperture with it. You mentioned the issue of having the variable aperture. So on the less expensive zoom lenses, when you see that there's a range, like it goes from 3.5 to 6.3 or what have you, it just means that as you zoom in, you don't have the ability to have that wide aperture, right?
Right.
And so that becomes limiting. So that lens that I mentioned I had, the 28 to 300, while the range was great, to have, you know, one lens and throw in your bag and go travel with, I find I was always limited with the aperture being 6.3
Right.
300, right? And so what was happening was I was always getting blurry images because my shutter speed was compensating to be too slow, right?
Right.
So then in that case, you need to increase your ISO, and maybe your camera's not good at that, and then, you know, so you get into a whole other problem, right? I would suggest, if you're not sure, see if there's a place in your area that rents lenses with the option of applying your rental fee towards one if you purchase it. Okay, because then you can go spend, say, $50, try it out for a day or two,
Right.
and decide if you like it, right? Give it a good trial run, a good test drive, and then decide if you like it. Maybe you want that lens, or maybe you want a different one, but it'll give you a feel of, you know, does my style really work with a wide?
Yeah, well, thank you. That makes a lot of sense, and kind of that's what I was thinking towards. Then I looked at a Nikon 12 to 24, which
Yeah.
had a fixed aperture, excuse me, of 2.8,
Mm-hmm.
and I thought it would give it me more versatility as far as low light and indoor photography.
That's a fabulous lens, and if it's in your budget, I would say absolutely that's a good choice.
Oh, better than the 10 to 24 Nikon variable.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, if you can afford the 2.8, great. You know, if you can't, I mean, the neat thing about the wide lens is, remember how you want that 1 over your focal length for your minimum shutter speed, right? So if we're talking about a 10 to 24 lens, you only need to shoot at 1/30th of a second to really, you know, get them sharp, right? So you don't need a 200th of a second. You can get away with a lot more with a wide lens on the shutter end.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so we talked a little bit about her question about buying a wide lens, and I would say, similar to what my answer was to Sharana, was that it really depends on what you want to do. So the question when I get it in my class is, what do you want to most photograph? So in terms of she's doing landscapes, a lot of photographers that do landscapes do wide shots. So what I would maybe suggest, Sharana, in addition to that, is go onto Google and excuse me, or Flickr even, and search for wide angle landscape, okay? And see what comes up, and see if that style and that look of picture appeals to you, okay? So a prime lens, for those that are not familiar with a prime lens, is something that is fixed. So it doesn't have a zoom range, right? I'm showing my 50 for the video. Okay, so the video doesn't show me later, but you guys can see this if you see me. So I have two primes. I have a 50 and I have an 85. And the reason that I like them is because they have a large aperture. Okay, so they have a 1.8 aperture, which gives me a really nice big opening. Okay, so specialty lenses, I mentioned the fisheye. Those are ones that distort the edges and go super round. Macro, if you're into close-ups and flowers and that kinds of things. You can get into other specialty lenses like really super long ones. Generally, when you get into really super long ones, you're talking thousands of dollars and you're into the big bucks. Okay? Okay, we mentioned crop factor earlier. So does my camera have a lens factor? If you have a cropped sensor camera, you do have what's called a lens factor. So it's generally 1.5 or 1.6 times the lens focal length. So if you say that I have a 50 and your crop factor is 1.5, then it's really kind of representing a 75. Okay. So think of that in terms of when you go to purchase your lens, what do you need, okay? Fast lens is that aperture. When somebody says, do you have a fast lens or I want a fast lens, it's the maximum aperture, okay? If you want, I can post an article I did for you guys on Digital Photography School on what do the numbers on your lens mean. And on the barrel of the lens, you'll see a bunch of numbers, and usually you'll see a ratio and they'll say 1 to something. This one says 1 to 1.8, okay? And that's the maximum aperture on that one. So on that lens, it's a 50, and I can go to 1.8 maximum. This is 70 to 200, and on this one, it says 1 to 4. Okay, so my maximum aperture on this lens is 4. So the longer lenses you get, the tougher it is to get a big aperture, and you pay a lot more money. Okay, so just to give you a comparison and a perspective, this is about a $1,400 lens. If you want to go up to the 2.8 with the image stabilization, you're looking at about $2,600. So photography is an expensive hobby. I recommend doing exactly what you're doing, which is learning to use what you have. learning the craft, learning the tools, and then once you're comfortable with those things, then be really serious about, okay, what is it that I need? Right? A lot of people want things, and of course we're human, so we all want things. But think about it in terms of what can I afford, and what do I really need to do the style that I want? Okay, what can I get away with? A lot of times, if you are someone who wants to go photograph wildlife, you're talking about a $5,000 to $10,000 lens. Can you rent that lens? You know, you could rent that lens an awful number of times before it pays for the cost of buying it. Right? So even if you have to pay $100 for a rental for a weekend, still a lot cheaper than forking out several $1,000s. Okay?
Darlene, before we leave this slide, we've got a question.
Okay.
What would be a good prime wide angle lens to get, and what should a person expect to spend for that?
Okay, who had the question?
Jillian.
Oh, I'm going to unmute you. Okay, so a good prime wide angle lens, there's several. What you're using, what camera, Jillian? You're unmuted. Oh, no, she's muted again. She can't hear me. Can you speak? You're muted. Okay, she can't speak. I'm thinking that
she has a Canon.
She's Canon. That's what I thought. That's what I thought. Okay, so if you're on a Canon, look through the Canon catalog and see what's available. But you can also look at the off-market brands such as Tamron. There's sort of three: Tamron, Sigma, and Tokina. Tokina is not one I would recommend highly. Sigma is one I would recommend highly. Tamron is kind of taking a backseat to Sigma lately. They both make some good products though. Okay, the difference between those and the Canon is you pay less for usually the other market brands than you will for Canon. A lot of times they're just as good, and depending on the reviews on them, sometimes better. Okay, if you want a wide on a Canon crop sensor, you might want to look at a 20. I'm not even sure what's available, to be honest. If you want really wide, like my 17, I'm not sure that there is something that's fixed that's that wide. You'd have to be looking at about a 12. Okay, so I would look through the catalog. I can post you guys some links, but look through Canon's website and see what's available for Canon, for your camera. If it's a crop sensor, you have to get one that's specifically made for a crop sensor, like a 10 to 24. I'll see if I can post some options for you in the Flickr group as well.
And what about used lenses?
Used lenses are fine. If you're going to buy a used lens, don't do it over the internet. You want to actually go and look at it and see it. What you want to look for is you want to take both lens caps off and physically look at the elements on the front and the back to make sure there's no big scratches. You want to look inside to make sure there's not a lot of dust inside. Even if there is, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because most of the time that's not going to show up. It's not going to ruin your image quality too much. My 85 has quite a bit of dust in it, and it's not an issue, partly because I'm shooting at 1.8 all the time, so it's not really throwing it into focus. So make sure it's physically good. Shake it. If there's something rattling, don't buy it, obviously. Take your camera and do a test picture with the lens on your camera. Ideally, take a newspaper or something with you that has a lot of text and photograph it flat against a wall. So tape it against a wall so it's flat, photograph it straight on, and then just check to see that it's sharp edge to edge and things like that, that it's evenly exposing from edge to edge, and look on your screen, zoom in all the way on your screen to make sure that it's sharp all the way across and that you're not getting light falling off one way to the other. Right? Hopefully that answers that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the homework for this week, and then we're going to go into the Flickr group and look at the questions that people had on their pictures. We'll go through those. So this week what I want you to do is practice working with lenses. There's 3 parts to this exercise. So first of all, find a subject that you can use to emphasize perspective. So something that is receding, so railway tracks, a fence, something that will look good where you have one piece closer and one piece farther away. Okay. A child might work well if you want to do something fun with a child. Okay, that presents a whole other problem, but work with that. Okay, so find something that's going to work well with perspective. Okay, submit one image from that one. Find something else to do with a long lens, so something that's going to be appropriate for compressing. Okay, feel free to watch the video if you want some examples again on compressing. So compressing generally is going to be a long lens, something where you want the background out of focus. Maybe it's a person. Make sure you get them away from the background. Okay. So do the same with a person, regardless if you use a person in the first two exercises. So similar to the samples I showed you with the little girl in the front yard, do one with the widest lens you've got and get in real close to her. The key is to keep the face the same size. So try and get really close so that the head size is the same in the wide angle picture as when you have your long lens on, and you're obviously going to have to back up. Okay, so as you put your long lens on, you're going to be quite far away from your subject. Okay, so take two pictures like that. Make sure they're facing you because you want to see the distortion that happens on their face, and it's quite noticeable if you have a really wide lens and a really long lens. So that is exercise 1.
Can I clarify something there, Dar?
Yes. Yes.
In that last section about keeping the head the same size, you want them to physically move back, not use their zoom.
Correct. Well, you're going to be zooming in, so you're going to change your zoom lens. So if you've got, like, for example, somebody mentioned the 18 to 200, so that's a perfect lens to do this exercise with. Put on the lens and go to 18 millimeters first. Photograph your person. You're going to be probably as close as your lens will focus to them. You're going to be less than a foot away, okay, to keep their head large. You want to be close. Then when you zoom in, you don't have to go necessarily all the way to 200 because that's really long. You're going to be across the street. Zoom into at least 150, maybe 200. And in order to keep them the same size, you're going to have to back up. Okay, so look through your viewfinder, back up until you see that their head is the same size. Take a picture. If it's not right, delete it, take another one. Okay. Something else to just mention is that if you're not in the habit of looking through the viewfinder on your camera, like the eyepiece, try and do that and not look at the screen on the back. If you're used to using the live view, turn that off and use the eyepiece. Okay? So you're going to have four images from this exercise showing lenses. Label them all exercise 1. Okay? It'll be pretty obvious which ones are wide and which ones are long, and we'll be able to figure that out. Okay? Second part is going to be motion. So we talked a lot about doing motion and freezing and blurring. So find a moving subject. So it could be, you could go to a busy intersection and photograph the traffic. You could find somebody to ride their bike up and down the street for you. If you have children, you've already got moving targets built in, or grandchildren, a pet, any of those things will work. If you have none of those things available, try to find a fountain or something. Okay, moving water makes a big difference to long shutter speed, slow shutter speed. Okay, so you'll see a huge difference from the first one to the second one to the end one. Okay, so do a range of shutter speeds and do freezing it and blurring it. Okay, full spectrum. Submit 2 pictures from that first part, one frozen and one blurred. You can take as many as you want. Okay. Try panning. So using the tips that'll be in your handout for your exercises, try the panning exercise. Okay, so moving along your camera with the subject. Okay, so setting it up so you have a slow shutter speed and physically following them in the scene. One image from that. Okay, assuming everybody has a tripod, which it sounded like they all did, everybody does. Try the zooming during the exposure. So you may want to go out during an evening or during a nighttime. Neon signs work really great for this. If you have a restaurant or something that has a neon sign, this works really, really great. Traffic lights can work great because sometimes the light will change during your exposure and you get different colors. So try the zooming exercise and label these ones exercise 2. Okay, so you'll have 4 images from this set. And these are just some things for you to do on your own. You don't have to submit images into the group for this, but if you have questions, feel free to submit them and just say, I have a question about this. So it's not necessarily for an exercise, but you're welcome to do these and put in an image if you have a question. Okay, so do some tests of your camera's ISO. Find a subject like I did with the mountain scene and take pictures of it at the lowest ISO and at various other ones up all the way to the top end. Okay, so you can shoot it at every single one if you want. Okay, and compare them. Compare them on the computer, looking at them at 100%. So zoom in to 100% or 1:1 if your software says 1:1, and view them full screen 1:1. Okay, so what that will give you is the pixels actually showing on your screen, and you'll see that noise showing up. So what this test will do is help you to find your comfort zone of where your camera's ISO kind of loses it. Okay, so you might decide that you're good up to 6400, you might decide you're good up to 12,000, or maybe you have an older camera and you're only good up to 1600, which was the case with the one I had before. Okay, so that's where my camera was limiting me, and I bought the new camera. Okay, I am not a big advocate of buying new things just because it's out. I'm an advocate of buying new things when the one that you have isn't working for you anymore. Okay? Play with the white balance, go out and find a scene and just take pictures of it at all of the settings and then see what they do. So it's just about learning what the settings do and how it affects your picture. Okay? You learn a lot more. I can tell you, I can give you examples, but you learn a lot more by actually going and playing with these things. Okay? So play with the aperture settings. Okay, so you can go on aperture priority, find a scene, and just take pictures of it at all different apertures. Okay? You may need a tripod when you get down to say f22. If your shutter speed gets too slow, just keep an eye on that. Okay. That's the end of the recorded version. If you are watching this video for the first time, please remember to print off the notes that came along with it. You'll see a link to the PDF below. And also remember to join the Flickr group. We have set up a private Flickr group just for people doing this class so that you can share your images. So if you feel that you're stuck on a particular assignment, you can go there and see how other people have done it and their homework and maybe get an idea on how to proceed. If you have a question, you could put that into the discussion area in the group. And of course, please share your images. It's one thing to watch a video and read the notes and take your own notes, but it's another to actually get out and practice and implement the things that you've learned. Only by actually getting out and doing photography will you find that your photography gets better. So if you want to get maximum value out of this course, please remember to actually do the assignments and further to share them with other people. Get comments on them, and if you need some help at any time, just let me know. Practice is key, so remember to practice, 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 and continue doing your photography every day if you can. That's it for this week. So remember that this is a self-paced class, even though that it is called 4 Weeks to Better Photography. Feel free to do this at your own pace. If every 2 weeks works better for you, that's just fine. And if you want to do it faster and do 2 lessons a week, that's fine as well. So feel free to go at your own pace and just disregard the title of the 4 weeks. If it takes you 4 months, that's just fine. The goal is for you to see progress from the beginning to the end. So that's the end of the lesson this week. Do take care, and we'll see you in the next video.